Welcome to episode 39 of Pearls of the Interior Life. Does this look like the face of a rebel to you? No, to me neither. But that being said, at certain times all of us may be called to kind of step outside of the lines on behalf of God. The trick is not to be a rebel without a clue. The trick is to be a rebel with conviction, and that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Our big goal is happiness in this life and heaven in the next. To achieve this, we need to stay close to God throughout each day. But how do we do that while living in the real world with all of its challenges and distractions? Growing our interior life through Christian mental prayer is the answer. This podcast mines the riches of the greatest spiritual tradition on earth so we can grow in holiness together. I'm Steve Smith. Thank you for joining me for Pearls of the Interior Life.
Well, thank you for tuning into this episode. Thank you for making this time for the Lord. Well, I'm certainly no rebel. I don't particularly care, especially drawing attention to myself despite making these videos. These things are certainly not in my comfort zone. That's a fact. This is certainly a face for radio, and this is not my standard thing to be doing. But I do it because I'm doing my best to respond to the Lord. And with that, there are times when we may be called to be something of a rebel. We may be called to stand out and to contradict the wisdom of the world, or going with the crowd. And that's the topic for today. How do we know when we're being called to do that, and how do we do that appropriately, and especially in our current times with the culture just so antagonistic towards Christianity, and Christianity just being completely marginalized, not even just marginalized, so there being active forces to completely obliterate it. We can't afford to be silent at all times. There are times when we're going to be called to stand forward, and this is where our interior life and our exterior life, where there's a unity between them, where our interior life guides our exterior life. That's the whole point of it. So first, I have a brief anecdote to give some context for this. Then we have a few takeaways. As I'm recording this, there's a thunderstorm, by the way. Probably fitting for today's topic. So the anecdote, we don't want to get wrapped around the axle on the anecdote. You may agree with me, you may disagree with me. More, it just gives us a point of reference for our points of how our interior life guides our exterior life. Maybe I did it right, maybe I did it wrong. You can decide. So at Mass this weekend, it was announced that the Eucharist must be received in the hand. Must. That was something new at church now. So there was not an option to receive on the tongue. Well, it's up until now, since churches have started reopening, it's been preferential, I would say, to receive Eucharist on the hand. It hasn't been mandatory. This is a little bit of a change. Now, my understanding is that that's not canonically right, that the church cannot prohibit receiving Eucharist on the tongue. Maybe that's right, maybe it's wrong. That's my understanding of it. Number two, I will say that I take odds with the church's response to COVID. I think they're basically in lockstep with a society that is completely irrational with this. We have infection fatality rates that are turning out to be much, much lower and much closer to ordinary flu. Yes, preferential to the elderly or those with existing serious conditions that can convolve with COVID, but by and large, the infection rates are showing much, much lower. And epidemiologists have expounded that receiving in the hand, it generally has little different risk from receiving on the tongue, and neither of them really represent much risk. And we could go on. So those are my personal feelings. Again, reasonable minds can differ on this. Up until now, though, I have received on the hand in deference to being obedient. I'll also say that all the problems that we have in the church, I think much of that can be laid at the feet of a lack of reverence for the Eucharist. And that's not me. Many people have made that case. So if anything, the last thing we want to be doing these days is diminishing the reverence and the dignity of the Eucharist, turning into just another way to transmit disease. Reason doesn't back that up, and faith certainly doesn't. God is not going to punish people for an increased reverence to the Eucharist. Okay? That being said, I believe the reverse is true as well. Even though I prefer to receive the Eucharist on the tongue, I also believe that that same loving and understanding God is not going to judge me harshly if I am obedient to what's required by the bishop and the pastor and trying to avoid causing discomfort to people around me. So that's how things have been going so far. All right, now we get to where this is relevant to our interior and exterior life. At Mass this weekend, when it was announced mandatory, must be on the hand, instantly I just had this prompting, receive on the tongue. Now, I have plenty of pride and indignation to go around, so my first instinct was, come on, Smith, that's just you wanting to have your own way in this. And I rejected that prompting. It kept coming back, and I'd keep testing it. Lord, I really don't want to do that. I've made my decision to go along and be obedient, to receive in the hand. I don't want to make some little mini spectacle of myself here at Mass. It kept coming back. Every time I would reject it, and in the manner of my rejection, inevitably, the celebrant would have something to say, and his homily even had to do with not walking in step with society, that there are times when we absolutely are called out to be different, to act in faith, and so on. At any rate, every time I would try to reject that prompting, something would bring it back again. And in a way, with an interior character that I've come to reliably associate with the Holy Spirit, and not just the voice of the enemy, my own inner preferences. So in the end, what I opted to do was to receive communion not from a Eucharistic minister, but from the priest. And I waited to go last in line so there wouldn't be anyone behind me that might be thrown off or disconcerted by it. And fortunately, I was very grateful the priest was willing. I received it, I went down on my knees to make it that much easier. He was willing to give me the Eucharist on the tongue. So that's the anecdote. Again, you can disagree. You might think Smith is out of his mind. That's fine. Here are the 3 points, though, that we take from this. First, this issue of kind of protest or rebellion. We are going to be called to that more and more. My little small act of defiance, of pushing back there, that's just one little example. You may be called to much bigger things. It may be speaking out at a school board meeting or at a community meeting where you disagree with what's going on, or it may just be the simple acts of faith that we do when we're in a public place of blessing ourselves before a meal, but where Christianity is more and more literally trying to be wiped completely from society. We will be called to speak out. The opposing side, especially just say the Marxists and the humanists, they're great at messaging and coining phrases, and their latest is silence is violence. So, from their perspective, if you're not speaking up on these great causes of injustice and overthrowing patriarchy, if you're not actively battling against it, you're doing violence to the cause. Silence is violence. And you know what? There's a lot to that. And we're called to this. We're called to this in the spiritual works of mercy, to correct the sinner, to instruct the ignorant. But care has to be taken, obviously, because a great deal of damage can be done there. And so the spiritual works of mercy have to be weighed in the balance against the other spiritual and corporal works of mercy, the example of Christ of bearing patiently with people, leading first with love, leading first with embracing, leading first with community. You lead with that before you think about correction. So it takes wisdom. It takes supernatural wisdom. All right, so this is the second thing. It's not our wisdom, that's for sure. Not my wisdom. We need the wisdom that only comes from the Holy Spirit, from our counselor. And that is why it is so important, our interior life, our daily time with the Lord, so that we know that voice. We can distinguish that voice. My sheep hear my voice. Well, you got to listen to that voice. You have to spend so much time with it. It can be very difficult because, again, the enemy, he disguises himself as a child of light. He's the deceiver. He knows he's slippery. Oh boy, he knows how to get his voice in there and deceive us, make us think we're doing things for good. So again, just that encouragement of why we have to spend time with the Lord, because we are going to be called out at times to step up and not be silent. And then third, it is to have that fortitude. When you look at the great saints, the great martyrs, how could they do that? How could they literally willingly go to their death? St. Ignatius of Antioch, willing himself to die bravely in the Roman arena. Well, again, it's spending that time with the Lord. You can't sacrifice yourself for someone you don't love, and you can't grow to love someone without spending time with them. And so having that courage, that fortitude to step forward when we are getting that legitimate prompting, again, that comes from spending that time. Even for me, just little things there, going at the end of the communion line and kneeling, receiving on the tongue. That is far outside of my comfort zone. I'm not going to leap out there just for no good reason whatsoever. So I share this with you just to keep our thoughts. The underlying principles, though, are, I think, very relevant to our time right now. That number one, silence is violence. We are called now to speak out in this culture and in positive, affirmative ways bring Christ back into the center of society, or at least demonstrate how Christ is the center of our life and bring that in. So number one, we're going to be called more and more to speak out, and at times it's going to be speaking out in ways that are going to contradict, if not just kind of public sentiment, actual outright requirements, laws, regulations, and so on. Number two, it obviously takes great care, because there's room, obviously, in that for great damage to be done. So what are those times when we are called to speak out and be a bit of an agitator, as it would be? That's why we need to be close to the Lord. And then three, to have that courage, that fortitude, to then act on it when we're getting that calling. Again, that is where we need to be staying so close to the Lord so that there isn't that hesitation. Because when you're in that moment, we're typically called to act, and act then, and act with certainty. St. Ignatius of Loyola, be aware, assess, and act. That's it, without hesitation. So there you have it. I pray that when you're in these situations, and you will be, we all will be more and more, and that you'll feel so very close to the Lord. And thank you for your time, as always, and I look forward to being with you again.